Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're continuing our book, Truth in a Culture of Doubt. And we're on Chapter 4 here, where our authors are discussing Bart Ehrman's claims that he has pulled from kind of a historical idea that wasn't his own. He's kind of popularized it. We'll talk about Walter Bauer as we go on. Yeah. This is kind of the Bauer hypothesis, but the claim is that there were many Christianities.
Many Christianities.
From the formation of Christianity.
Wow.
And so what we think of as Orthodox Christianity, which is just the standard, what we think is like, okay, Christ rose from the dead, he saves us from our sins, he was God. Those all kind of fought for supremacy within the scope of a mishmash of other ideas, like Jesus had a body, he didn't have a body, he taught salvation by different ways. Put whatever you want in there.
Right. So this isn't the idea when we say many Christianities that there are lots of Jesuses running around.
Right. Yeah.
These are interpretations of who he was and what he said, kind of thing. Right.
And so it's kind of this idea that, and you see it with claims of the Old Testament, is the Israelites, the Jews, the God's people are kind of writing more about what they believe about God, not so much that God inspired the words or that it's a direct revelation from God, but here's kind of their interpretation. And so who won? Well, history has decided kind of the victors through kind of 8 points that we're going to go over. Right. And so that's what our authors are going to do. And you'll hear probably a lot of times us saying, and Michael Kruger wrote a book about this because Michael Kruger probably wrote a book about everything within the scope of this book and some of them with Andreas Kostenberger too. So as we're getting into Chapter 4, were there many Christianities, what we're covering. And so there are 8 claims that we're going to cover here.
So that's a lot.
Right. Luckily, some of them are pretty short. We can make mincemeat out of them, aka our authors we can repeat them back to you. So the first claim is that the German scholar Walter Bauer, his book Heresy and Orthodoxy in Earliest Christianity, that's the name of the book, Heresy and Orthodoxy in Earliest Christianity, was the most important book on the history of early Christianity to appear in the 20th century. A big claim.
Yeah. Most important book on Christianity. Right. That is a big claim. Right. On the history of Christianity.
Right.
Yeah.
The argument made by Bauer is incisive and authoritative, made by a master of all the surviving early Christian literature. Wow, okay, going back to the sources. Yeah. Ad Fontes. Writing from equally early and legitimate heretical forms of Christianity do not currently exist because, why? Because they were destroyed by the proto-Orthodox in the first century. Okay. So we'll unpack that a little bit as we go through. Yeah. So the third claim is that early Christianity was widely divisive. Diverse. It was also divisive, with no group having a legitimate claim to the, quote, true form of Christianity. So they're all kind of just out there fighting for supremacy in some way. Fourth, you can never rely on the witnesses to write an unbiased account of the past. The New Testament is unified because the winning Orthodox party got to choose what was in its canon. So kind of the might makes right. History is written by the victors, etc., etc. Yeah. Fifth, the diversity of views within the New Testament indicates that Jesus was not originally considered to be God in any sense at all. He eventually became divine for his followers in some sense before he became to be thought of as equal with God Almighty in an absolute sense. So
Jesus became God.
Yeah. So this is what was covered before.
As a result of who won the argument.
Right. So this is kind of how Ehrman got to the conclusion that he wrote an entire book on that other people responded. You can go back to some of our earlier ones, and links for that will be included below. So then the sixth claim is that 2nd and 3rd century Orthodox leaders, so the people that kind of won out, were innovators rather than guardians of tradition. So they kind of created it. Right. They're creating what is now known as orthodoxy. So they kind of coalesced all the things that they wanted to for Christianity to teach.
The stuff that they liked. Yeah. Right? There was a bunch of stuff out there. They grabbed, picked, and chose what they wanted, and that became Christianity.
Everything together so that we fight about it today, and we can say that the Bible is authoritative and doesn't contradict each other because they did such a good job, and so we're the apologists of them. Seventh, Orthodoxy, which was the product of a much later church councils, so now we're moving to church councils, did not exist in the first century. For example, none of the apostles claimed that Jesus was fully God and fully man. They didn't say those words, that you can't find them saying that in the New Testament whatsoever.
Yeah.
Or that he was begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father, as the 4th century Nicene Creed maintained. The victorious group called itself Orthodox. So the creeds, the councils, the terminology, things like Trinity. You can't find Trinity in the Bible. Therefore, it's a later manifestation of the victors, the winners. They wanted to teach the Trinity for some reasons.
Or at least you can't find the word Trinity in the Bible.
That's true. That's true. And 8th, and our final one, that the creation of the canon was one of the strategies used by the proto-Orthodox, before Orthodoxy existed, to diminish the authority of other early Christian literature. So there are all these other hidden books of the Bible found, and we reach into the tome and pull out this thing called the Didache, and what does it say? Well, it kind of says exactly what's in the Testament.
The Didache was pretty good.
Yeah, the Didache is really good. In fact, I just had a discussion with somebody about that, and one of the kind of Lord's Prayer discussions of, do you say at the end, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and forever? The Didache actually, it contains that. And so it lends to this idea of, well, maybe that was in the original. So really geeky stuff that you can get into. Didache, fun read, short, good stuff. Yeah. And so those are the 8 topics that we'll kind of be covering. We'll probably split on 4 and 4, or depending on
how far we get.
How far we get, as always.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, so he starts off this chapter by talking about the power of cherished beliefs. He says that sometimes people want something to be true so badly that they believe in it, even though the facts point in an opposite direction. Right? So they really want it, right? And so they, regardless of the facts, they really want it, so they believe it. Mm-hmm. He says they say at times Bart Ehrman treats people who believe in the Bible as if they were small children who wanted to hold on to the magic of the stories they grew up hearing in Sunday school. Believe even when the historical evidence doesn't back up their belief, right? So he suggests that those who have confidence in the Bible are simply sticking their heads in the sand and are not really considering the evidence, or at least not objectively considering the evidence, right? So
we never made it out of Sunday school. We're all going, Jesus, for every answer.
That's right. Every answer is, the same.
Right. So when it comes to the origins of historic Christianity, Ehrman believes that in the 1st century there was no such thing as Christianity in the singular sense. There's no kind of overarching, there's our basic understanding, and there are secondary, tertiary disagreements, which, lo and behold, we kind of have today. And so it's improper for us to kind of argue for this pie in the sky type monolith of Christianity that we can point back to and say, we're divergent from it. So, that it lends to all sorts of implications from there if there are these different Christianities.
Yeah. So no such thing as Christianity, in the singular sense. That's an amazing claim.
Yeah. Right. And so we'll see if that holds to historicity. Yeah. So there's no such thing as this Christianity as being coherent. It's a widely agreed upon set of beliefs, but only Christianities in the plural sense. Right. So all that existed were different versions of Christianity that claimed to be true with equal legitimacy. So it's not just one to say, it kind of started out in Jerusalem, but then Corinth kind of like spun it a little bit and kind of took a collection of beliefs, and they say, well, if you kind of add, Jesus is a good teacher, and he rose from the dead, but he wasn't killed by the Romans. Because he didn't exist in bodily form, then that's the Corinth version of Jesus. It's the Corinth Christianity.
He got married and had children, So when he talks about Christianities, he's talking about various versions or interpretations or ideas of what Christianity was and who Jesus was. Right?
And he's saying that this was at the beginning, so it wasn't just a response to heresy that came in or a later development. This was smack dab right at the beginning. And according to Ehrman, who later became what later became the traditional version of Christianity, now known as Orthodoxy. So it's kind of the Orthodoxy wasn't at the beginning. It fought and clamored, and whatever existed, the dust settled. That became Orthodoxy. So right. Orthodoxy again is this
winner take all.
Yeah. This understanding of the basics of Christianity. It was simply the particular form of the earliest Christianity that happened to win the political power struggle in the 2nd through the 4th centuries of the Christian era. And there is some truth to some of these claims, and other ones we'll figure out just how historic they are.
Yeah, right. So, as we mentioned, just as Erdman has ridiculed evangelical Christians for covering their ears, right, or sticking their head in the sand to the evidence so they can continue holding to their own cherished beliefs. It's interesting, however, that Erdman's readers should consider the evidence in order to discern whether Erdman's narrative, which happens to fit nicely with the cherished beliefs of many in our culture, right? This postmodern culture, is supported by the actual historical evidence available with regard to first century Christianity, right? So who really is sticking their head in the sand? Who really wants to believe based on their view of things, right?
Right. And posting some of these videos concerning Ehrman, I've had responses from people that tell me to go back and read Bauer's, Heresy and Christianity. So it's like, well, I know where you're coming from, and I know, that you're probably deriving that from Ehrman or his suggestion, but there's more to it than that, and we'll talk about further reading as well as our discussion here. So let's deal with the first claim. So. All right. First claim is that the German scholar Walter Bauer's his book Heresy and Orthodoxy in the Early Christianities was the most important book on history of early Christianity to appear in the 20th century. The argument made by Bauer is incisive and authoritative, made by a master of all surviving early Christian literature. Wow. So, kind of this
Bauer
history
is the man.
of Bauer is, he kind of writes in this like 1930s era. Unfortunately, something big happened in the 40s. I'm not quite sure of what it was that kind of held up translations from all different ones. And if you go back and listen to my conversation with Robert Murphy, we talk about how Ludwig von Mises, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, whatever that means for economics, or the Nobel Prize, he too was held up because of the inability for people to kind of gain access to German thought books, because the German schools were producing great works, and then Bauer's. so you can go back and listen to our discussion there.
All right, so what's Erdman's paradigm, right? How does he view things? So ideas obviously do not appear out of thin air, and in order to better understand Erdman, it's important to understand a little bit about the origins of his theory, a la, Bauer, right? So Erdman's paradigm is built on the work of a scholar that we've talked about here, Walter Bauer, who wrote at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1934, Bauer, in a work entitled Heresy and Orthodoxy in Early Christianity, argued that the traditional form of Christianity, that is orthodoxy, right, was actually nothing but the view imposed by one early Christian sect on the rest of Christendom. Right, so the orthodoxy that we hold today about who Jesus is and what he accomplished in his his birth, death, and resurrection, that sort of thing. There was a sect of the several Christianities that believed that, and that sect won out. It was the most powerful, and so that's why we believe that today. Yeah. But in the beginning, there were lots of Christianities. There were lots of views of Jesus, is what Bauer argued, right?
Right, and so they kind of cast their lots in this historical lottery, and they were the ones that happened to cash out in the end. Yeah. I don't know what they cashed out on, because it seems like persecution. And,
really. And we want this.
Being kicked out of towns
we want this like view, even though it means we're going to all die. Right. A terrible death, burning at the stake every day.
So Bauer also asserted that the Roman Church's control over certain regions at the end of the 2nd century allowed Orthodox groups retrospectively to alter the history of the early church and destroy evidence from early diversity in order to cement their own control over Christendom. And I don't know if he is implying kind of like this Roman Catholic Church, or just the Church of Rome seemed to be the biggest and so exerted the most control over it. Right. And unfortunately, and I hate to start disagreeing already, but reading early letters of Irenaeus and Clement is talking to Corinth, and he's extolling them, even though the Catholic Church claims that Clement is a bishop. He's extolling the Church of Corinth to to renew their commitment to a plurality of elders. Not, I, Clement, Pope of Rome, have decreed this is how you should order your government. Or your church government,
right.
And then opposite of that is Irenaeus, where he's writing to the bishops of Rome. So early, first and second, third century, these letters come out, and there's no monolith, there's no pope, there's this idea of the Roman Catholic Church version of history. We don't see it in history, and we can go back to earlier church fathers who are making claims that you wouldn't make if you're Pope Clement or this monolithic version of Christianity that is decrying their edicts upon the different churches and dance for me or swear fealty to me. It seems like they're going back to the Bible and saying, hey, 2 Peter established a plurality of elders. You had to kick a bunch of your elders out because of impropriety. You can't just have it be out there. You have to elect new elders and vice versa. Talking to the bishops of Rome, so there's not a single bishop, aka the Pope, that we would consider today, and so that whole thing. So there's a lot of history involved in these claims that Bauer doesn't seem to kind of consider because, and we'll see a little bit, kind of moves the timeline a little bit to be able to talk about that.
Right.
Not to disagree with Bauer immediately, but I'm disagreeing with Bauer immediately. So, however, the main lines of evidence used by Bauer in support of the thesis have been widely discredited.
Right. Moreover, critics have rightly pointed out that despite the title of his work that suggests he will explore, notice, excuse me, earliest Christianities, right? So, we'll see what the earliest Christianities are about, because that's what his title talks about. Bauer has remarkably neglected the earliest available evidence we have. What is that? Well, it's the New Testament documents themselves, right?
He
doesn't look at those.
Yeah,
right?
You can't just throw them out.
Right? Instead of studying these and other first century documents, Bauer, his book is almost entirely devoted to second century and later works, which he then, kind of reads back into the first century.
Right. So think about this: if you have like a history of the Mayan and Aztec religion of sacrificing children and whatever building pyramids, just think about if you had a source that was known to people, widely known to people, and it talked about how the sacrifices came to be, or how they viewed astronomy, or how they viewed this coming snake creature that has white skin that we should listen to. Just think about if you just completely ignored that. Historians wouldn't do that,
right?
But they do it for, at least Bauer does it here, for the New Testament.
Yeah.
Draw from your sources. All of a sudden, these churches pop up, and you're not like, well, what's the source of that? Oh, well, we already know that.
Right.
No,
let's start 100 years into the deal.
Let's go. Let's
or 50 or 100 years later. Right?
Year zero. Start at zero. So it doesn't seem like Bauer is taking advantage of all of history here. So assuming that, I guess, once a church forms and pops up in year 100, that's when you start counting. I'm not sure where why he wouldn't draw from the early sources, because Paul does. He establishes churches. So,
early.
So if you're looking for early Christianities, I'm establishing them, and then the three trips around,
around
and
the letters that resulted from them, right? That's what you want to look at.
Very important.
Yeah.
So Ehrman has kept Bauer's conclusions, but the details of the argument have changed. This raises the question why Bauer's thesis should be considered, as Ehrman put it, incisive and authoritative. That's how Bart Ehrman puts it. The examination of the arguments below will make clear that though the Bauer-Ehrman proposal makes for an attractive narrative in the currents of our contemporary culture, aka popular, anyone who adopts such an account must be firmly committed not to allow those pesky details to get in the way of a good story.
That's right.
And so it seems like they're wanting their conclusion rather than doing good history here.
Yeah, good. So that was the first address, right? This how important Bauer's book was, right? And we see that there were some problems with that, right? Bauer didn't go back to the earliest sources, right? He kind of started, into the second century and then kind of said, well, this was what was going on. Well, why don't you just look at the New Testament? That's the earliest, right? And see what was
deal with
going
that
on.
first. Yeah.
Yeah, right. The second claim is that writings from equally early and legitimate heretical forms of Christianity do not currently exist, notice, because they were destroyed by the proto-Orthodox in the first century. Right? So these early writings, these heretical writings, were destroyed by these folks who won the day, right, in the second century.
Yeah. Right? The hidden books of history, so
That's
hidden
right.
that they remain hidden.
Yeah. How do we know this? How do we know they were destroyed?
Right. Well, that's the problem. The problem with the claim is that it's an arguments from silence.
Okay.
There's no evidence to support it. So all these other writings, every single one of them was rounded up. They were burnt. They were destroyed. They were hidden away in a deep, dark cave, and we just haven't found them yet.
Right.
Or they did such a good job that even though we have over 5,000 manuscripts of the early Gospels and the letters from Paul and other letters from church leaders, those were preserved, but not these pesky secondary or the losers. The losers.
The losers, yeah. The losers got lost.
Right. This American Christianity, we're all about winners. So they exist somewhere out in the ether of at this point, you would have to kind of make inferences to put it so that you're not just calling Bauer kind of a fantasy. It doesn't seem like there's anything to kind of sink your teeth into in this claim of they were just all destroyed. Well, okay. I have proof that God exists 100%. Anyone that looks at this piece of paper will instantly believe I left it in my car, and the car's on fire.
That's right.
So it was destroyed. There. It was there.
It was there. Yeah.
But okay. So if anything, the evidence, as you will see in our next claim, suggests that the heretical groups producing texts in the 2nd and 3rd century were either not widespread in the 1st century or, in some cases, had not even come into existence. Right. So this one is kind of shoots itself in the foot because you're asking for historical evidence. And you say, well, it must be there. And it seems like
it was there, but it's gone now.
It seems like the theory is informing what evidence you're bringing in, which we talk about presuppositions and the importance of them. So here it's we're savvy on that.
That's right. So his third claim in this particular chapter is that early Christianity was widely diverse, with no group having a legitimate claim to the true, right, quote, form of Christianity. It was just a wild west, right? All kinds of things were being talked about. All kinds of things were believed. And so no group really had a legitimate claim on what the true form of Christianity was. Right?
So we're not going back to the New Testament. That's wrong for some reason. And the thing that would help us to determine whether this claim is accurate, those sources that we can say and point to and say this was an alternate claim that just didn't win the day. Those don't seem to exist anymore or have been preserved in any form of fashion. Okay, I mean, I'd love to see the evidence. Let's see. We're all evidentialists here, right? So the existence of divergent 2nd century groups proves that diversity existed in subsequent centuries, but is not directly relevant since this is not evidence from the days when the church first came into being, aka the 1st century.
That's right. So even though there may have been and there was, by the way, diversities in beliefs in the 2nd centuries, we have the Gnostics, which we'll talk about here in a bit, and all these types of groups that sprang up. Notice that doesn't prove that was going on in the 1st century, right?
Right. And so Michael J. Kruger, as I said, we would say, Christianity at the Crossroads, his latest book, that talks about how the 2nd century shaped the future of the church. That's the subtitle there. And so what he makes the claims of is that the church arose in the 1st century, is starting to get settled in the 2nd century, and here comes evil Gnostics and all sorts of other groups that the apostles, especially in 1 John, seems to be writing kind of a proto-Gnostic pretext.
Yeah.
So he's, First John's talking about the physicality of Christ. Jesus came in bodily form. Well, John, why are you talking about that?
Yeah.
It seems to be a starting to
kind of defend against some of these Gnostic beliefs.
Which one of the beliefs of the Gnostics was that Jesus kind of came in kind of this ethereal form. He's not physical. A lot of the Greek informs that belief, because the Greeks, especially you see it in Paul in Mars Hill, he doesn't. He kind of gets jeered at when he talks about the resurrection of the dead and being brought back to life. And for the Greeks, that was the physicality is the evil stuff.
That's
kind
right.
of there.
Right. Spirit is more.
So Michael J.
real.
Kruger is, and we'll include links to all these books below as well. So thus, one of the problems with the Bauer Ehrman thesis is that it illegitimately presents evidence from the second and subsequent centuries as relevant to discussion of the origins of Christianity, while minimizing the first century evidence. So again,
we've already dealt with this, right?
Right.
So let's look at the evidence. Okay, there's a diversity of Christianities. How do we know? Well, in the second century. Well, wait a minute.
Is that where the church started? No, it started in the first century, and this is all agreed upon history of the Gnostics came in. This is where, if you're, again, I hate to pick on Old History Channel, but this is the hidden books of the Bible, and this is a Gnostic tome, and this is description from hidden Christianity. Well, no, the fact that we have these volumes, I think, is interesting because a lot of it is preserved in the speaking against Gnosticism and the like. So
yeah.
We're starting at the cart, not the horse, or we're starting at the church, not the donkey,
or something like
something.
That. Yeah. So when Ehrman begins listing heresies of the second and third centuries, it might feel like a powerful argument. Look at all these heresies, right?
Look at all these Christians that are popping up. They're all using the name of Jesus.
Yeah.
They're all doing it for a personal thing. All these groups arise. The leaders tell them, the physical is not worth it. Castrate yourselves, and lo and behold, once you do that, you kind of die out because you're not reproducing, and also you're asking people to do something that seems a bit harsh. But some people did it. And they preserve for one, maybe two generations, depending on who they can convince. But that's a hard sell.
Right. So he lists all these second and third centuries heresies. In reality, even though this seems like a powerful argument, it serves only to divert attention from the central question, which is, what is the state of Christianity? What was it in the first century? Right. That's the question.
Started. Right.
Yeah, that's the question.
What was it like at the very beginning? Did it have Jesus is God and Jesus is only a man, and Jesus went to the East and brought Buddhist teaching, or here's a vision of Jesus only? Was it Judas? Not Judas. The Muslims think that Simon, I believe, takes the place of Jesus on the cross, and Jesus walks away scot-free. Yeah. So which one is it that this is? Well, unfortunately, those might be important discussions talking about different beliefs of second, third century when these groups started to intermingle and rise up. First century is where the church started. Yeah. And even Ehrman admits this stuff. Right.
So the real question is whether diversity evident in the subsequent centuries actually preceded the unity which is found at Christianity's origin, right? So again, the question is, well, there was all of these diverse views, and the strongest, most powerful position, people won. Well, and so this is important. Why? Well, because we want to know what Christianity really was. Well, the way to do that is to go back to the beginnings, the first century writings, and see what it was. Well, Ehrman is suggesting, there wasn't a beginning per se of a certain kind of Christianities. There were lots of these Christianities, and so the winners came up with the one that they believed.
Yeah, and it would be interesting, and Christian pastors and scholars, they all kind of survey the New Testament writings and say, oh, look at the Church of Corinth. What does it teach us about the differences between how they worship versus how the Jewish church worship, or the church in Jerusalem worship? Mm-hmm. Or what does the letter to Paul to the Romans say about a people group that he's been wanting to visit since the beginning because he's a Roman. How does his letter writing compare to something like the Ephesians or the Galatians?
Right.
Well, those are important things, and we see diversity of different types of thought, but do we see diversity of Orthodox? If you can call yourself a Christian, this is what you hold to.
Basic beliefs of the Christians.
Do we see differences within that scope?
Right. So the question is, do we have the real Christianity?
Right.
Or is it something that won out over a fight over many Christianities? Well, the way to determine that, at least one of the ways to determine that, is look at the first century documents, the New Testament, and that sort of thing, to see what the real Christianity was all about.
Right.
Erdman is claiming, well, we don't have the real Christianity. We only have a Christianity that won out because of powerful folks in later centuries said this is the one we wanted. Right.
And Bauer seems to suggest that it's a Roman type thing. It's not Paul. It's not Peter. It's not James. It's the might of Rome. Okay. So even if, let's say for the sake of argument, the evidence for the 2nd and 3rd century were to show that heretical groups were widespread and stable, argumentative, this would in no way prove that they were equally widespread and stable in the 1st century. Right. Okay, which you have a hard time again because it's a group that's attempting to invade into the early church, and that's why a lot of times the apostles and the early Christian writers were of the New Testament were saying, "Be on guard, wolves in sheep's clothing." I mean, this is if you've been to church services, you've heard these sermons before because it's still prevalent. It's something that they had to deal with. Once all the apostles were gone, and probably even more so within their midst, but definitely when they were going away, and you had other people enticing them away for different reasons and whatnot, and even today. So, in fact, the evidence for the 2nd and 3rd century points in the same direction as that from the 1st century. In both cases, orthodoxy was more established and stable, while heresy was less widespread and unified than Ehrman implies, and Bauer on top of that. So we see that actually being less of the case. Right.
So as we mentioned of the various 2nd century heretical groups, Gnosticism clearly posed the greatest threat to Christianity.
The hidden knowledge. And so you have these teachers rise up and they say, you have these teachers rise up and they say, I have the hidden knowledge that will get you to eternal life. And you mix in a little Greek, which was well known in Greek philosophy, and then you mix in this new and kind of up and coming popularizing among not just the rich but the poor, not just the men but the women, not just the pious but the former prostitutes. It's getting popular, and now, how can I take advantage of this? So it seems to be that's
so. What they'll do real briefly in the rest of this chapter is, instead of reviewing all the various groups, right, that sprung up in the 2nd century and for later, they'll focus their survey on what can be known about Gnosticism in comparison to Orthodoxy, right? Right. All right, so to begin with, then, Gnosticism is actually a label for, notice, various diverse religious ideas, they tell us, right? So it wasn't one basic idea of what Gnostics believed, right? There were lots of beliefs. Actually, there were many Gnosticisms, right? Not Christianities, but Gnosticisms, right?
Even the biggest Gnostic person that's kind of most popularized it, even their group wasn't that well known.
Yeah. So and they point out that the ideas really never developed into a single organized movement, right? Because the various Gnostic groups only shared a few key similarities, right? So,
also, if you keep things secret, things stay secret. Our founder died because syphilis or bad water or a donkey kicked him in the shin, and we don't have the ability to save him. Well, we're done.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
He held the keys. So most likely, because Gnostics could not agree among themselves, they never formed a church or groups of churches. They formed in small communities, and we see them come into churches and try and take over and kind of socialistically tread on the capital of the prophets. So there we go. I factored in a claim from economics there for everyone. So this lack of organization and unity within Gnosticism stands in stark contrast with Orthodoxy. And we see that growing quickly. We see it growing diverse among, again, people, types of people, groups of people. Paul and his companions, John Mark and the like. Luke. They go on 3 missionary journeys and make their rounds. It started out in the church in Jerusalem. But if we don't ever look at the New Testament documents, we can't ever start at the beginning. Right. We're starting too late. So the emphasis on the rule of faith, the early agreed upon set of core Christian beliefs, that's what we kind of call it. If you say kind of your creeds within church, this is kind of the what you can do in the scope of a few breaths. And so this is what the rule of faith is the early agreed upon set of core beliefs. So the emphasis on this demonstrates an early unity in Orthodox writings. And we see that especially, you have Paul going out and people are saying, oh, this guy's really hard to understand. Are we sure that he's speaking true scripture? And go to Peter, and Peter goes, I know it's sometimes hard to hear, but that's what the gospel is. It's sometimes hard to hear. And what Paul is talking about is scripture. And so Peter backs up Paul's apostleship that Jesus established.
Right. So not only was there a lack of organization in Gnosticism, and not only was there much greater organization in early Orthodox Christianity, and they held to what our authors are calling the rule of faith, which they'll get into a little more later. But also, early Orthodoxy had no official authority to suppress what they perceived to be heretical teachings, right? Right. Who was the authority, or what was the authority? I mean, you had a bunch of little churches all over, or house churches, or people dying or running or whatever, right? And so there was no real authority. It wasn't until AD 313 when Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan mandated religious toleration, right, that the Christians acquired official means to take action against heretical groups. Right. So that was, quite a few years later, right? By this time, there was no mention of Gnostics, by the way, right? So this suggests that Gnosticism was definitely refuted before Orthodoxy had any official power to do so.
Right, and we have a lot of early church fathers writing things and against different types of heresies, and we see that throughout Christianity for the next 2,000 years, minus the first 100, you have responses and people coming in and trying to add to the gospel, take away from the gospel. You have Athanasius coming in, standing up and preserving, an idea of the Trinity as biblical. All these things come much later than the first century. So the implication then for this evidence concerning Gnosticism is that if the Gnostic movement was the biggest threat to Orthodoxy in the 2nd century, the sects that posed considerably less of a threat can likewise not be considered as early or well-developed as Orthodoxy, right? So they just didn't have enough oomph at that point than the biggest ones, okay? So also it is patently absurd to believe that the broad Orthodox unity and organization of the 2nd century appeared almost out of nowhere, that it just arises. Right. Again, when you cut off the 1st century.
Proof is there.
I'm a church. Well, okay. I guess we'll go with that. No questions of what do you mean a church? What does that mean? Communion, you're eating people? You call each other brothers and sisters. These were claims that outsiders infiltrated the church and went, oh, they marry their brothers and sisters, they're cannibals, and they're atheists because they deny other gods. So, again, even the Romans didn't like atheists. So it appears kind of almost out of nowhere. The most reasonable appraisal of the evidence is that doctrinal unity had early origins, a.k.a. or i.e. Jesus and the apostles were the source of that. Right. So by contrast, it appears the heretical movements were less organized and widespread in the 2nd century because they were parasitic of orthodoxy. Again, they leached off what was already there, a la socialism. These heresies were later deviations from orthodoxy rather than equally legitimate claims to the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. And we see that. We see Paul, we see Peter, we see James pointing back to Jesus, pointing back to his teachings. We see that with the early church fathers. You can form all the words of the Old Testament or of the New Testament just by quoting early church fathers. And the fact that any of that arose, stuck, was continued, was published, was so wide known that we can collect those things. We can talk about post-Nicaea, anti-Nicaea, all these things point to the fact that Orthodoxy was established early, and people were pointing back and wanting to go back to the sources. And in fact, once you get to the Reformation, the ad fontes, the back to the sources, that was, it was a contention to even claim that it never disappeared, that there was always this remnant, and the Roman Church had so diluted the message of the gospel that they were out of sync, and they were wanting to go back to what the early church fathers was, which was to reference the New Testament of the teachings, the authoritative teachings of Jesus and the apostles.
Yeah.
And so if you want more reading to this, again, we briefly covered 4 of these. We'll briefly cover 4 more. Andreas Kostenberger and Michael Kruger.
3. We covered 3.
Covered 3? Oh, man, we only covered 3. Yeah. Okay, well, unfortunately, we only covered 3, and it's not been 40 minutes. So well, we've only covered 3 because we like to talk. So more of the information can be found in Michael J. Kruger and Andreas Kostenberger's The Heresy of Orthodoxy, which is their response to the Bauer Ehrman hypothesis. And so, again, Michael J. Kruger has written pretty much a lot on this, as well as Kostenberger has written a lot on everything else. So those are always good books to pick up. And so we'll end it here. We got through 3, and we'll try and finish the rest next time. So thanks for joining us, and thanks.
We'll see you next time.